The first thing I wanted to ask you was, after all your years of writing nonfiction as an academic, whether writing a novel was like being let out to play and to do what you wanted suddenly.
Well, absolutely. If I look at my academic career, such as it was, it consisted of dozens and dozens of academic articles, about five academic books of, sizable ones, and endless footnotes in all of that. And every fact which was written down had to be what we would call today fact checked. And also, academic language is very limited, and in my field, which was strategic studies, quite pompous. So I really needed to break out of that situation from time to time, attempted to write, found I didn't have the time to do so. And so when this came along and I started to write, I thought I was in heaven.
In that process, you took on the task of creating a sense of that social change through the characters you wrote about. And that's quite an act of imagination. I think you achieved that wonderfully. So do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And first of all, about the point of social change, the 60s came along with changes, the sexual revolution, a sense of rebellion, Vietnam. And this was both exciting and profoundly unsettling. And also in my own life, I've experienced directly the decline of what one might call the old squattocracy. Uh, and that was a direct experience. So I certainly wanted to chronicle these changes. And as you say, I think it's difficult to do it in the form of a novel. And I wanted to do it from, in particular, two perspectives. On the one hand, we have the character Nick, who really wants to experience the world through a search for meaning and a search for creativity and art, rather than simply adopting the given role, his given role as heir to Owl Creek, this great big rural property. And this particular quest to experience the world through a quest for meaning and art, it happened to collide with the 60s in a really unfortunate way. It left him profoundly centerless and unsettled, and indeed cut adrift and floundering. Richard, on the other hand, the son of a stockman, was driven by a different sort of a need to rise above his background, to assert himself, to be successful, and in a sense, underlying all of this, to gather power. And this seemingly left him better able to cope with the 60s. He had a much stronger sense of direction. But it also involved a profound betrayal, a betrayal of his father's old, decent Catholic working class roots for a much more right-wing orientation, and along the way to power, a betrayal of other people who'd helped him and with whom he had personal relationships.
The process of creating an imaginary world has demands that insist that you reform those immediate memories and experience into something that is true to the novel. And I wondered if you had something to comment about that.
Well, I think it's very autobiographical in the general sense of the changes about which I've just been speaking. My lifespan reflects almost exactly the lifespan of the main protagonists of the book. So in that general sense, it is very autobiographical. That said, the characters are not entirely the characters of my own life by any means. Again, there are elements of Nick which I can see and recognize. His dislike of shooting and killing things. Same with me, although in my case it was mainly because I was a poor shot. But there are others as well. His shame about his social status. I felt that as a young kid as well. What is true to my own background is the hardness, the toughness of that, the leanness of that environment. There are also elements of other houses I've known. People who know me in my childhood will know that attic very well, which is mentioned in the beginning of the book. Equally, Richard's tendency to think of himself as a man of affairs, a kind of Thomas Cromwell type figure, someone who's willing to compromise, as he puts it, to break eggs in order to make an omelette. That comes out of my own experience as a public servant. Not that I'd achieved any power of myself, but I'd seen people who had, and I'd sort of talk to them about the rationale for what they had to do, the slippery, slimy things they sometimes had to do. And incidentally, that Cromwellian self-justification around compromise versus a man of affairs who achieves things is absolutely anathema to Nick. It's another point of difference. For Nick, compromise is death. For Nick, he wants to work at the very outer reaches of what is safe in order to create and to find out about truth. I think that growing up on the land gives one a sense of the people who work there, their language, their mannerisms, and so on, which I found absolutely invaluable.
Yes, I think, Sandy, one of the things that is the strength of the book, that they were also alive to you in your discomfort in the contrast between the station, the social station of the people involved, because you have a feeling for all the people's position in the book, which I think is probably a reflection of your empathy for people generally, and your discomfort as a child, as you say, you were embarrassed or ashamed of your social station. I think that's actually been an advantage to you in writing the book.
Well, certainly Nick is put into that framework, although he's a much more, in a way, courageous person than I ever was. He's able to live his beliefs a little bit more, but that also leads him into a terribly dark place.
Yeah, so Sandy, I have to ask you about that word honor that we've discussed quite a lot through our discussion, and the role of honor and duty in the life of Mujahid, who Nick encounters and we meet throughout the book, and how they seem to come from very different backgrounds, but in the end, there's something they share.
At one level, I think you're absolutely right. Nick's and the Mujahid's birth sense of honor, let me put it that way, are very, very similar. And that goes back to the history of the old squattocracy, if I could refer to them in that way. To them, loyalty, bravery, and honesty were everything, and particularly bravery and one's war records and an absolute bravery in the war and commitment in the war were very similar to the sort of tribal loyalties about bravery and honor with which the Mujahid, who was a Pashtun, grew up. And the Pashtun have an acute sense of tribal honor, which is built around those very same issues of loyalty to one's tribe, bravery, and determination to defend one's birthright. In another sense, cowardice, as far as Nick's family is concerned, is almost the worst of crimes. In fact, Nick was disinherited because he won't go to Vietnam. So from this sort of belief about the failings of this traditional sense of honor, he derives a somewhat different sense of honor, where he comes to think of it as internally driven, and that you have to be true to yourself to be honorable. He's still very interested in honor, but it's a different sort of honor. And there's an irony here, because in dying, his father expresses very much a similar sort of view. He says, I don't know what God wants of me, or even if there is a God, but I know that I want to die to be considered a man of honor.
Yes, I mean, obviously Nick does damage in his life to various people, but I think the feeling that I had in terms of his coming to terms with his life, his taking responsibility in some way and trying to be honest with himself, is part of his honorable path in the end. I don't know if that was something you intended.
That's absolutely right. And also, and this is a he recognizes this weird sort of twist that if he is to die, he wants to do it properly in that old-fashioned sense of being brave and having a good death. And he realizes totally the irony of this.
Yes.
He thinks he's moved away from that.
But in the end, he's doing what his father would have done.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
And also, ironically, the Mujahid respects him in that moment too.
Yes, again, without giving too much away.
Yes.
I think he respects him. He respects him both in that sense, in the sense of his sense of honor as being a good person, but also he respects him as an intellect as well. And one of the things they really share is that intellectual discourse, although it can only go so far because they have a set of deep differences around religion and what it is to be a human being.
Yes, I think in the end, the Mujahid, even though he feels a commonality with Nick, doesn't respect the framework of his beliefs and views.
No, and he doesn't respect the West, and he doesn't respect particularly the wishy-washiness of the casuistry of the West, he says with some contempt, Nick says, well, if I was anything, I'd be a sort of Buddhist. And the Mujahidi says contemptuously, sort of. You Westerners don't even know what you are.